Hi everyone, my name's Stacey and welcome to Quilt Club with Stacey Lee. In this video we'll be making a French braid table runner. Now this is a great little project because it's basically a mini quilt. We'll be going through all the same steps we would to make a quilt, except we'll be making a table runner. So let's get sewing. Please go to my website, the link is in the description below for full instructions including materials required and how to cut your fabric to begin the project, and I'll meet you at my sewing machine. Okay, so now I've cut all my strips. The next thing I did was I married my pairs up. So I've got my 10.5 inch strip here and I've got my 8.5 inch strip here, and together they will make my V. So what I did was I married each of them up. I put the 10.5 inch on the bottom and the 8.5 inch on top. And I did that for all my fabrics so that I knew what I had to work with. And then what I did, I organized them in the order that I would like to sew them in. So if you can imagine that each of these different fabrics is going to be in different V and they'll be sewn together in this order. So this fabric here will be my first V, then this will be the second, third, fourth, and so on. If you don't want to sew yours in a particular order, then you could just marry them up like I've done here and then just sew them together however they come to you. Or you might not even want your V's to be the same fabrics, so you could just sew them together however they came. But I personally wanted to do a pattern. And as you can see, this is the pattern I've chosen. So now I'm going to sew it together. Okay everyone, so before we start sewing, I have put a fresh needle on because I have just finished a quilt. You might want to do the same. I've got a full bobbin in there, so I know I'm not going to run out of my bobbin in the middle of my project. I've got my 1/4 inch foot on and my painter's tape to help me see my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've checked my stitching and I'm on stitch length 2, so I'm all ready to go. Okay, so we'll take our 2.5 inch square and then we'll take our first 8.5 inch strip, which is our shorter strip, and we're going to be sewing them together like this. So what we need to do is make sure the right sides of our fabric are facing up, and then we'll fold our square over on top, and we're going to stitch along here past the end of the square and just a bit on there. So line up the edges. You can use pins or not, that's entirely up to you. I'll just pop one in here and then we'll sew that at a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm just going to come past my square. We're not doing back stitch or anything because we'll be sewing over these again when we sew our binding on. So now we need to decide if we're going to press that open to get a nice flat surface, or if we're happy to just finger press. Now I know some of you might not want to keep going back to the iron and so forth, so you can just finger press that down if you'd like to, or if you'd like you can press them with your iron. So if I come over here, if we're going to go to the trouble of pressing, we might as well set the seams like we always do, and then we'll finger press that open and press it. And when we're making our French braid table runner, what we're going to do is we're always going to press these seams up and away from where we've just sewn. So we've just sewn along here and then we're folding it up and away from it. So we'll do that every time we're pressing our seams. Okay, so then we'll pop this down here and then we'll take our next strip, and this is our 10.5 inch strip, and we're going to sew that one on like that. So again, it's not along the whole length of it, so I'll just turn that around. Now again, we've got the good side of the fabric facing up. I'm going to fold this over on top, and then I'm going to match up the edges. I'm going to match up the edges of the fabric on this side and along the top, and when I'm happy I can pin or I can sew. So I always think there's no harm in pinning. So let's just pin. And my seam there is coming down this way, so I'm not going to have a problem with that. But just make sure you can feel that it is sitting the right way up when you're sewing. And again, I'll sew that at 1/4 inch, and the underneath side is underneath. So I'll just keep an eye on that and stitch past where it finishes. Okay, so now we've sewn our first V. So remembering we're either finger pressing with our fingers and just sewing on like that, or we'll use our iron. So I'm choosing to use my iron, so we'll set those seams. And then I'll press that open. So it's a little bit fiddly here now because we've got this funny bit sort of turning over where the sewing stopped. Just do the best you can. So I'm finger pressing that and pressing. And remembering those seams are coming up away from my sewing. Okay, so now we'll take our next shorter 8.5 inch strip and we'll be attaching it on this side again. So this side will always have our 8.5 inch strips and this side will always have our 10.5 inch strips. So right side's facing up, then I'll fold that down onto the V, and then we'll be sewing along this edge here. I'm just going to flip this over so I can sew it along this way on my sewing machine. And I'll be lining up my edges on this side and at the top and pinning. Okay, and now we'll sew along that edge. And this time my seam is facing up that way. So I'll just make sure as I come to it, it is sitting correctly when I sew over it. And I'll just make sure I come past the end of my fabric that's underneath. And again, either finger press or iron those seams. And then we're going to take our longer strip again that matches this fabric because mine's matching. I'm getting those matching V's and I'm placing it like so with the right sides all facing me. Then I'm going to fold that down on top. I'm going to make sure those edges are matching up and the edges here are matching up. They're all lined up nicely, and then I will pin them. And I'll be sewing along this way, and I can feel that I've got a seam that is facing this way up. So I'll just need to be extra careful that when I do come along and sew across that it is facing up so that it will sit nicely when it's finished. So if you wanted to, you could check now that it's still facing in the right direction. And you can usually feel if it's sort of trying to twist on you. And then I'll come past the end of the strip there and press. Okay, so can you see how we're getting our nice little V pattern now? So what I will do is I'll carry on until I've sewn all my V's together, exactly like I've just shown you. So now I've finished sewing all my V's together. You can see it's getting quite long and I'm really happy with it. What I would like you to do is give it a press over the whole top, and then we're going to baste them like a little mini quilt, and then we'll quilt them and bind them. Okay, so I've finished my table runner top and I've given it a really good iron and I've cut off all my loose threads. Now I'm going to baste it. So it's just like basting a mini quilt. I've got my backing fabric here, and if your backing fabric has a pattern, you have the wrong side facing you. So if this was a pattern, this would be the pattern here and it would be facing down towards my table. So then I'm going to take my batting and I'll just place that on top and I'll smooth that out. And it's just like doing a little mini quilt. We want it nice and smooth, not stretched, but not all wrinkled. And then I'll get my quilt top, or my table runner top rather, and I'll place that on top. Now the funny little jagged edges are not the edge of your quilt. We'll be coming along and cutting that all off. So don't worry if you feel like it's not fitting. I've got an inch spare on either side here. And then I'll just smooth that out. I'm just going to make it nice and smooth, give it a nice pat. And at the end here, I'll just bring that down. We're actually cutting all this off. So don't feel too stressed if your top bit hasn't got a backing and batting, because we'll be cutting it here. Okay, so once you're happy with that and it's sitting all nice and smoothly, we need to just pin it in place. Now because it's so small and we're not constantly trying to maneuver it, we can just use normal pins for this, and you can use just a few and we can move them as we're sewing a lot easier than the basting pins we usually use. So as I'm doing that, I'll just double check it's nice and smooth, and I'm going through all 3 layers. Okay, so now I've put in all my pins. They're about a hand space apart, and we can move them and add more or do whatever you're doing at the time if you feel you need to. I might just pop one more in here. There's no hard or fast rules, just whatever you're comfortable with, and just making sure it does feel nice and secure. So once I'm happy that I've got enough pins in, I'm going to start quilting. Okay, so now I'm going to quilt my table runner, and you can quilt yours however you'd like to. I've decided to do stitch in the ditch, and what that means is I'm going to sew right along these edges here on every single seam line. And when we do stitch in the ditch, there's the raised side, and that's where the seam's been folded over and it comes back under, and this side it feels a little bit raised, and then on this side it's lower. And when we do stitch in the ditch, we stitch right in this ditch here as close as we can to this edge, but staying on the lower side. So I'm going to do that for all of my V's. I've got my walking foot on. I've tested my stitches and my sewing machine is stitching nicely, and I've decided to stitch at 2.5. So now I'm going to go along and do all my V's. And when I come to the join, I'm pausing, I'm lifting my foot up, but first I'm making sure my needle is down. I'm lifting my foot and I'm turning. And I'm turning it so that it's facing me. My line is facing me. I'll put my foot down and then I'll carry on. And I'm coming right past the edge of the V, and then I'll stop. So I'm coming up to where my V joins again, and I'm pausing. I'm making sure my needle is down. I'm lifting my foot up and I'm turning it towards me where I want to sew. When I'm happy, I'm lowering my foot again, and you might notice I haven't started in the middle and worked my way out. Because this is such a small project, we'll be fine. So it's starting to get a little bit bulky on my right hand side, so I'm taking out the pins as I go, and I will start folding it just to make it a little bit easier. And remember, I'm just going nice and slowly. It's not a race, and the slower you go and the more time you take, you'll get much nicer, straighter sewing lines. Okay, now I've finished quilting my table runner. I've done stitch in the ditch along all my V's, and once you've finished quilting your table runner, let's square them off. So now I've finished quilting, now it's time to square off our table runner. And what I did first was I did give it a really good iron because it did get a little bit crinkled being rolled up. So I've made it nice and smooth again. And we're going to start at one end, so I'll just move it down for you, because it's bigger than my cutting mat. And what we're going to do is we're going to line up our ruler and cut from the corner of the square to the next corner of the square. That will be the line we go by with our ruler. Of course, we'll be cutting all the way across, but we'll be lining the ruler up with this corner and this corner. And then we can double check that straight by also lining it up with this corner on this V and again on the opposite corner of the same V. So I'll take my ruler and I'm lining it up right on the corner of the square, on both sides of the square. And then I'm also checking that it's lined up at the top of this V and again on this V, and it's slightly out on this V, so I'm just going to move it down until they're all lined up perfectly. And then once I'm happy, I'm going to make my cut. Okay, so hands fanned out, pinky off to the side, fingers away from the edge, locking my blade on, and I'm just going to check again. It's lined up on the corner of this V, on the corner of the square, the corner of the square, and the corner of this V. And that's our first line to work with. So now we want to cut our edges, but this is a little bit tricky because we want to make sure our V's are sitting in the middle and that our cut edges are nicely parallel and not going wonky. So what I want you to do is take your ruler and roughly draw a line up the center of your table runner with a washable pencil. So I've actually got a chalk pencil here that is washable, and that's what I'm going to use. I personally don't recommend washable markers. I've had a few problems with them in the past. I like to use chalk, but use whatever you've got and whatever you feel most comfortable with. So what we're going to do is we're going to just first of all mark little lines showing where the rough straight line is, and once we're happy then we'll rule that straight line to use to cut from. So I'm going to be taking the points of all my V's and working out the most accurate. So some of them aren't 100% perfect. For example, this one lines up, this one lines up, this one not so much, this one not so much, and this one not so much, but this one does, and this one does. So when I feel like I've got my average point, then I'll draw my lines. It's not going to be perfect. And I'll just do some rough little lines here, so I've got a guide to go by. And then I'll move my ruler up, lining them up again with the points the best that I can. So I'll just move my table runner down. And then I'm going to carry on from where I started so that the ruler is on some of the lines I've already done, so we know we are straight. And then the best I can, I'm lining it up with the points. And your table runner might be a little bit crooked, so you can give it a little bit of a tug and sort of maneuver it and help you get those points to the right spot. So I'm just finding the original two, and it's looking a little bit wonky. So I'm just giving it a yank to help it be straight. So this point here is perfect, and perfect, 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 perfect. And it's just a little bit wonky up the top here. So I'll just give that a little tug. And that looks really good now. So I'll mark that. And then when I'm happy that it's nice and straight, I will rule a line, and that will be the line we're going to use as our guide to cut from. Okay, so now we're going to take our ruler and we're going to line it up with the markers we did, remembering they're not perfect, but they were the best we could get. For example, this one's perfectly lined up down the bottom, and then it's perfectly lined up again here at the top, so we're just going to go for it. All my little markers are in line. Just check that, and then I'll rule my line. And then I'll move my runner down and I'll continue on. And now what that means is we're going to use those lines to measure out from. We'll line up our ruler on those lines and we'll be cutting along this edge here, which means our V's will be nicely centered and our edges will be parallel. So now I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to find 5.5 on my ruler, and I'm going to line up 5.5 along the whole ruled line. I'm going to move it down because I don't want to start off the edge. And if this line was square, it should line up perfectly now. If it's not square, you could fix this bottom cut if you need to. So that's at 5.5. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5, and this 1/2 inch line is on top of my ruled line all the way up. So once I'm happy, we're not double checking or triple checking, we're checking to make sure that's right, guys. And when you're feeling happy that that's nice and straight, we're going to start at the bottom here, hand fanned out, pinky off to the side, fingers away from the edge, and we're going to cut this excess off. Pausing, coming up, pausing, coming up. And now we've got our first cut. Then I'll bring that down and finish it off. So again, lining up at 5.5 along the whole line, and I'm coming up past my quilt top here, and I can see it's nicely lined up at the very bottom. So again, hands fanned out, pinky off to the side, fingers away from the edge, locking it on, double checking, triple checking, and checking again in this instance, and we're good to go. Pausing, coming up, pausing, coming up, and that's our first cut edge. So then we'll turn it around and we'll do exactly the same for the other side. Okay, so now we're on the other side. I'm going to place my ruler on my ruled line at 5.5 inches all the way up, and I'm going to double check and triple check that's correct. I'm going to place my hand down firmly, pinky off to the side, fingers away from the edge, and I'm going to check that again. Once I'm double checked, triple checked, I'm absolutely sure, I'll cut, pause, move my hands up, pause, move my hands up, then I'll bring that down and continue on. I'll line my ruler up with the lines, and then I'll cut. Okay, so now we'll cut off the last end, and we are losing this point here. We are coming into this point, and I'll just cut it at 1/4 of an inch off the point so that when we do our binding you'll see it. So I'll line my ruler up on 1/4 inch from the point, and if I line my line up on my ruler on this edge, it lines up perfectly along the bottom, and that is exactly 11 inches. So that's a really good sign. It means it's nice and straight and parallel. So once you're happy, I've just lined it up 1/4 of an inch off that point for our binding, and then I'll cut. So we're just checking they're nice and straight, double check, triple check, everything's good, and then we'll cut. Okay, so now we've squared off our table runner. Now it's time to bind it. So what I'd like you to do is refer back to my previous video where I tell you how to make your binding and bind a quilt, because this is essentially just a mini quilt for our tables. Okay everyone, I trust that you found my binding tutorial okay, and now you've finished your table runner, and it should look something like this, although in your own fabrics. And then on the back, again, something like this, or you might have decided to quilt it completely different. I hope you've found a nice place in your home to put it and it's feeling all homely, or perhaps you've decided to gift it, and I look forward to seeing you next week for our next project.